Hi everyone, welcome to our next video in the week 1 series on line graphs. This is a continuation of section 2.1 in your textbook. So a line graph is used for two variable data or with numeric frequency tables. Data of this type can be expressed as ordered pairs, x comma y, and plotted on the coordinate plane. So if we're dealing with two variable data from a stats experiment, we're talking about x is the independent or explanatory, y is the dependent or the response. If we're looking at single variable numeric data in a frequency table, x are the values of the variable, y is then the frequency. And we've got an example here. This is rainfall over the course of a few days in a month, first 9 days of a month. So days of the month is the explanatory. Those are the things we're comparing to each other. And then rainfall is the thing that we're measuring in response. You'll see a couple of things. First, you'll notice that the dots that represent each day are connected. And that is why it's called a line graph. We do use lines to connect successive data points. The next thing you'll notice is this graph actually was nice in that they put the y value, the rainfall in millimeters, next to each data point. You will sometimes see that in many of the types of graphs we do to make it more legible. It's very helpful when you have data points that lie between two grid lines. The other thing you'll notice about this graph that I expect to see in your graphs is both axes are labeled, days of the month, rainfall in millimeters. Without those labels, the graph is meaningless. I don't know what I'm looking at a relationship between. So we're going to do, just like we did in the last video, we're going to do an example together, and then I've got to try it for you to try on your own. So for this example, in a survey, 40 mothers were asked how many times per week a teenager must be reminded to do their chores. The results are shown on the right. So we have a frequency table. You'll notice they've left off the relative frequency, which leads me to believe that when we draw our line graph, we're plotting number of times teenager is reminded versus frequency. And remember, when we're plotting something versus frequency, frequency is always the y-axis. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a grid system. I'm going to get my axes going with frequency on the y, number of times teenagers are reminded on the x. So here's my grid, and you'll notice a couple of things. First, I labeled those axes. Number of times teenager is reminded, frequency. I've also got y and x as labels there. The other thing you'll notice is that I've got my numbers labeled. So when you're numbering your axes, the first thing is that the gap between each grid line, each labeled axis, needs to be the same. So on the x-axis, I'm counting by ones, 0 to 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 3. On the y-axis, or frequency axis, I'm counting by twos, 0 to 2, 2 to 4, 4 to 6. If I start counting by twos, I can't start counting by threes later in the problem. I can't go 2, 4, 6, 9, 13, 18. I have to keep that gap between them the same. Making sure your scale is uniform makes the shape of that graph meaningful. So now that I've got my axes labeled, we're going to start plotting points, x comma y. So my x for that first row is 0. So here's 0 on the x. And then my frequency, or my y value, is 2. So there's my first data point, 0, 2. The next one is 1, 5. So over 1 on the x, up 5, which is going to be halfway in between on the y. Next one is over 2, up 8. And then over 3, and all the way up to 14. over 4 and up 7, and then over 5 up 4. Once I've got my dots, I'm going to go ahead and connect them with lines to produce my final line graph. This line graph shows a nice clear peak at 3 that decreases on either side. So that's a nice clear graph with a very clear shape. We know that our peak is at 3 times. So most of teenagers needed to be reminded 3 times to complete their chores. Okay, so I want you guys to try this one on your own. In a survey, 40 people were asked how many times per year they had their car in the shop for repairs. The results are shown on the right. Construct a line graph. So you might want to grab a sheet of scratch paper and a ruler. You're going to take this graph and do exactly what we just did in the last example. Set up your axes. So number of times in the shop is your X, frequency is your Y, and then plot those points, connect the dots with a ruler. Pause your video. I'm going to go ahead and move on to the solution. Okay, so here's my solution. And you'll see very similar to last time. I've got number of times in shop and X on my X-axis, and then I've got frequency and Y on my Y-axis. And then I've got 0, 7, 1, 10, 2, 14, and 3, 9. Just like last time, connected those dots with nice pretty straight lines, and then you can see a nice clear peak at 2 times in the shop for this graph. If you have questions about how to draw line graphs, please let me know. Otherwise, I will see you in the next video.